to cover 3 areas today. The state of the union movement, the impact of the next series of employment law changes which the government has got planned and which within the next 2 or 3 weeks will be introduced into Parliament, and just the general context in which all of these things fit, in particular in relation to the work that you do. So, firstly, as you know, the CTU is driving a major union change agenda, and that program includes a number of elements that I'm not going to go into all of them today, but your organisation has been deeply involved in their development and implementation, and I know there's been a continuous series of articles on them in your journal as well. But in doing the union change agenda, obviously the first thing we've done is identify the problem and look at where we want to be in the future as a movement, and then try to develop strategies to help us to achieve that. And the reality is that for many workers, including increasingly workers who are delivering public services, union membership is becoming a risk rather than a right. And it's becoming a preserve of the few rather than the many. So currently, only 21% of workers in New Zealand benefit directly from union membership and participation. 61% of public sector workers are on collective employment agreements, compared with only 9% of those in the private sector. There are only 2,500 collective agreements existing in this country, and there's 126,000 enterprises that employ more than 2 people. That leaves a bit of a big job, 123,500 employers where there is no collective agreement at all. In 2010, union membership declined by 2.1% overall and 0.1% in terms of density. 21 of our 37 affiliates recorded membership decline in 2010, with a further 11 reporting increases of less than 100 members. And the reality is that you are more likely to be a union member in New Zealand if you have a degree, if you earn more than the average wage, and if you've been in the job for more than a year. And this is just the membership figures, because actually what we really exist for is influence. And unless we extend those who are able to participate to those that are unable to participate in unions at the moment, unless we extend the offer of affiliation and association with us, then the influence that we seek to have over the nature of work in this country is severely diminished. Because we are a social movement with a strong set of values about what New Zealand and the world should be like, about the contribution that working people make to the country and to the economy, and about what that work experience should be like for those people. We're the only voice that speak up for people at work. And we are working at the same time against a very strong narrative that is pushing back against our role. The narrative that's being developed by business and by the government is that working people are beneficiaries and that employers are benefactors, running their bit of charity. And that any concept of reciprocity in the employment relationship is nonsense, and it is being undermined by things like cuts to work rights that allow employers to dismiss workers unfairly in the first 90 days, and being undermined by concepts like contracting out of labour that shifts all the risk to the employee and removes all of the employer's reciprocal obligations that would be inherent in a normal employment relationship. Many workers now find themselves working long hours for wages that afford a decent life, working long hours for wages that don't afford a decent life. And more workers can find themselves working all week or more and still spend the weekends at the food bank or find that their electricity has been cut off. And that isn't the deal that we signed up for. That's a deal that's developed over a number of decades with very little script, very little agreement, and very little challenge. But it's not a deal that we agree with, and it's a deal that we have to challenge. Within that charity narrative, workers should be grateful to have a job, grateful to their employer, not challenge anything, not ask for decent pay or decent work rights, and the government should do all it can to support these charities, because in the end the beneficiaries need them as well. And if you don't believe me, we've seen a number of very compelling cases where this narrative has been pushed out into the public arena over the last couple of years. And Pike River is the most stunning example of this. That mine, the Pike River mine, was portrayed most strongly after the blast as providing a great service to the West Coast, providing jobs where jobs were much needed, a good deed, a charity. And those workers were portrayed as taking risks, bravely taking risks in an industry, knowing the risks but being prepared to take them to get the coal out. And all government support after the explosion in that mine was provided to the CEO to tell his story, while families that wanted information, particularly in those crucial few weeks after the explosion, were reliant on him and had to attend those media conferences to get any sort of information. The CEO was given the chance to speak to the nation at the State Memorial Service, which had no family involvement. And at that service, he told the country how these men were drawn to the mine because of its new equipment and culture, where good, safe operators were quickly identified. Now, we know there's an inquiry underway into Pike River, and the true attitude of the company to its workforce is now transparent. But regardless of the outcome of that inquiry, the shareholders of Pike River will and have walked away from that mine scot-free, leaving behind debt and death and accountability as they move on to their new venture. And that is not a charitable model. That mine was open only 1 year before it exploded, and 29 men were killed, including a 17-year-old boy. That boy was employed as a contractor to a contractor, and he was on his first day down in that mine. These men and boys weren't being fed by Pike River. They were trading their labour for wages, and they had the right to do so in a safe workplace. Now, Pike benefited from the labour of Joseph Dunbar, 17-year-old Joseph Dunbar that day. But as a contractor to a contractor, no reciprocal obligations were entered into in terms of their obligations to him. There was no reciprocity. He owed duties to Pike, they owed nothing to him. Look, such was the rhetoric in support of that company that the CEO of Pike River was nominated for New Zealander of the Year 3 weeks after the mine exploded. Let's have a look at the ports. The Port of Auckland planned to sack its entire stevedoring workforce and replace them with contract labour. It would still roster the new labour, train them, allocate them, and effectively be able to dismiss them by reserving the right to refuse any worker it didn't like access back onto the port. However, it would not be the legal employer. It would not be directly responsible for the enforcement of health and safety, or for things as simple as unpaid wages under the contracted relationship. These labour companies that they were seeking to engage were not to bring innovation, technology, or equipment onto the port, the things that we know build real productivity improvements. They were bringing only labour, and they were to clip the ticket on the way. These workers were to have carried out the core business of the port, loading and unloading ships. And they would have owed all of their duties to that employer as an employee: loyalty, honesty, fair day's work. But they would have received none of the reciprocity inherent in the employment relationship: security, a collective bargaining opportunity, fair treatment, respect. It was a ruse to reduce the cost of labour. It was a modern sweatshop they had planned for those wharfies. Now, because of a massive campaign, the port was forced to go on the defensive and seek public support for its plans. It had assumed the public would naturally support it. It found itself in deep water. It had to come up with a new strategy. It did so by attempting to create an image of an undeserving workforce, that they were overpaid, that they were bullies, that they were thugs, and that they were inflexible, hanging on to unrealistic expectations like having 1 weekend off in 3. The assumption was that the public would buy into this, particularly within the context that many of those in the public's own working experience was likely to be more dire. And the port was relying on promoting the charitable model of work and depicting these workers as ungrateful beneficiaries. And you've seen the result after a huge campaign. It's not over yet by any means. These workers have gone back to work with massive support from the people of the country, but they still have to achieve the collective employment agreement. You know, those wharfies, they changed the narrative from overpaid, ungrateful, lazy wharfies who had it coming to a story about decent working people trying to hang on to their family life. And it took effort, and it took a counter counterintuitive campaign to that which the port expected. The port hoped and expected that ships would be stopped all around the country, that manufacturers would close down through lack of supply and other workers would be stood down from their work, that little Mary's christening dress would be stuck on the port, unable to get it out of a container. Instead, it got families talking about their work, their kids, their life, already hugely influenced from working in a 24/7 industry with few limits on when they had to be available. And Aucklanders got it. They stood up, they turned up in their droves, 7,000 marching in support of 300 working people. Ministers, priests, rugby league stars, actors, iwi, community leaders, union members in their thousands, and even some major leaders of business who broke with the traditional employer organisations and supported these workers. The attack, as I say, on these port workers continues, and the negotiations are now undercover because they're in facilitation. But you can read between the lines what continues to go on in that bargaining. You know, the port's plans attracted little outrage from the political community. Only when it deliberately breached the privacy of some of its workers by leaking confidential information about them to the right-wing blogger Cameron Slater did most politicians express any true outrage. It was okay to dismiss these workers and replace them with a cheap workforce, but it was not okay to breach their privacy. This narrative of the beneficiary is now being used to undermine public sector workers in this country and around the world. Public services and government spending are being depicted as the cause of the global financial crisis. The collapse of financial institutions and the housing markets have been forgotten, and the attack on public services is seen as the cause and cutting them as the remedy. Standing in the way are the public sector unions. They are the last bastion of strongly organised labour in most parts of the world. They not only fight to protect the terms and conditions of service for their members, but unhelpfully they also speak up on the value of public services, speak out for the public, for their protection, and reflect the value to the community that those public services provide. Governments have undertaken a concerted attack to undermine public servants in the public eye. They're undermining the very services that they provide, and they're doing this to remove the power of these workers and of their unions. In the United States, it started with the teacher unions. In the UK, it was the core public sector unions in the first instance. They are depicting public sector wages and conditions as sitting outside the norm. And as they cut taxes, they are able to show the growing proportion of the tax take that these services are costing. Taxes have become a dirty word, and good governments cut them regardless of what they might be used for. They categorise public sector workers as backroom bureaucrats and their union leaders as union bosses, out of date, with no understanding of the challenges that the economies of these countries are facing. And you can see it here. I know you've felt it in your own workplace. You can see a concerted attack now on teachers and on public schools. And coming soon, there will be changes to the employment law that are directly aimed at public sector bargaining and union membership. And the Cabinet paper that has approved these employment law changes says that. It says these changes are aimed at public sector bargaining. The changes will remove the duty for employers to conclude a collective agreement. It will allow them to walk away from bargaining, leaving no collective agreement in place. It will remove the protection for new workers to be offered the collective for the first 30 days of employment, allowing, as the Cabinet paper describes, without shame, employers to reduce terms and conditions to new workers. And the changes will allow employers to refuse to bargain meccas aimed at ending national DHB and school arrangements, and in our education sector in particular, making way for charter schools. Making way for charter schools to end our beautiful, beautiful state education system to which 98% of our children attend. We've seen the impact of the removal of union bargaining rights to public sector workers in the United States, where public sector unions in Wisconsin have seen their membership halve over a very short period of time as bargaining rights and fees collection provisions have been removed. The UK is taking a different approach through the massive shutting down of services and the contracting out of the rest. Whole public sector endeavours are being contracted out, moving these workers out of public sector coverage, moving their rights as citizens, full rights as citizens, and putting them in a very precarious situation. If I were to ask in this room for people to put up their hand if they were in a precarious work situation, fixed term contract, very few people would, because actually one of the citizens' rights that you get from permanent secure work is that you can attend a union meeting like this. But you're obviously, in terms of the public service membership, more and more of your members are being shifted out into the margins, into contracted out work, onto fixed term agreements, being brought back in as contractors, or on the verge, always under the threat of being made redundant or contracted out. Casualisation in all its forms is creating a new paradigm for how workers experience work. Work is becoming an opportunist exercise rather than a long-term relationship. Citizenship is being removed. A class other than citizens, with more limited rights than citizens, is being created. And if you think about the rights of citizens, civil rights, the right for equality before the law and to be safe from harm. Casualised workers, contracted workers, fixed-term workers have fewer employment rights than those that are permanent. Many of them are being criminalised, and we've seen that with the attack on beneficiaries. You're most likely to be injured at work if you're not in secure employment. Cultural rights, another right of citizenship. The right to participate in the life of community. Poverty, transience, no working relationships excludes those workers from the ability to participate in the community. Social rights, the third element of citizenship, to access social protection. Casuals, contractors, fixed-term workers do not get access, for example, to ACC so readily. KiwiSaver provisions are denied them. Economic rights, the right to undertake income-earning activity is restricted as workers have to go from opportunity to opportunity and weigh up each one against the other to determine whether they'll take the risk. Political rights, to vote, to stand, to participate in unions are restricted for casualised labour. All of these are impacted on by precarious relationships, and these are now long-term embedded types of relationships dominating the new economy. So it's extremely challenging. Our challenge as a movement is to defend the public sector, to ensure the myths of privilege are busted, to reject the narrative that anyone with union protection is an ungrateful beneficiary, and to stay strong to our principles and to be flexible and smart with our tactics. The CTU Union Change Programme is part of that thinking. We must allow more workers to easily identify with us. We must reach into communities and provide support to resolve the issues that workers are facing. It's easy to paint unionised workers as the elite in the bigger picture of how work is becoming. Our program includes leadership development and resource sharing, but the three areas that I want to focus on today are the law, the new organisation, Together, and union values, but very briefly. So briefly on the law, the union movement is at one with the view that the current employment relations law makes collective bargaining very difficult for most workers. Unless you're in a unionised workplace with sufficient density, then the opportunity for collective bargaining is very, very limited, and the majority of workers have their terms and conditions unilaterally determined by their employer when they start a new job. We want a law that is used in other countries where there is good collective bargaining and union rights, that expands collective bargaining based on standards that are negotiated in the industry. So if I can give you an example, in disability support, if the PSA are negotiating and winning collective agreements as they are with disability support providers, then all providers of disability support would have an industry agreement that they needed to comply with. It would be expanded, those standards expanded, so that anybody working in the sector would have access to those standards. If you're working in food retail and the first union are negotiating with the big supermarkets, the standards that they negotiate would be expanded into an industry document, so anybody working in food retail would have access to that collective agreement. That's the sort of law we need, where the outcomes are that collective bargaining is the norm, not the exception. Second area of work we're looking at is the threshold for union membership. It is very, very hard to join a union in this country. You have to be in a place where there is a union, where there's a delegate, they give you the form, it's all the traditional way of joining. Well, for many workers, that is the situation they find themselves in. For young workers, many of them are expected to join more than one union, let alone one union, because they may have 1 or 2 part-time jobs. But for 91% of the private sector, most workers will walk into a workplace where there is no union. The union movement has created a new union. It's a union run by all the unions of New Zealand, and it's called Together, and I know that many of you people have heard about it because the PSA has been at the forefront of running this new union. We're very, very grateful for that support to the membership support services, and the call centre support services are very much appreciated. You are at the front line of this development. The concept behind Together is that it's a low threshold, easy access organisation that union members can sign their families up to. So by being a member of the PSA, you can join Together and sign up your whole family to Together. Now, I don't care who your family is, we're not DNA testing, because there's 20 of you who you consider to be in your whānau. Make my day. Are we better off or worse off if the 20 people that you consider closest to you are connected with us? Together has the potential to build on the strength of families and use families who are already committed to trade unions to build our association with many more workers. If we were able to get 50,000 trade union members to sign up their whānau to Together, and the fee that by adding $1 a week to their union fee and signing up as many people as they like, not only would we have around 200,000 more people associated with us, getting our messages, able to access our support, but we'd have about $2.5 million a year for organising in new sectors, for reaching out to communities, and for offering genuine union membership to workers who are currently excluded. We're not saying to the first union, it's your job to organise every retail worker in the country. We're saying to each other, it's our job to offer union membership to every retail worker in the country in a way that modern social movements are doing it all around the world. We haven't cracked Together. We're finding it hard to get people to join. We haven't quite got the message, the mechanism, or the methods, or perhaps even the resources to push it out like we want to, and I'm being very honest with you here. We want workers to think about ideas about how we can sell the message of Together and get people engaged in it. We have tried a number of things, but the reality is that it's very, very small, and everybody thinks it's a great idea, and people get the concept of it and believe in the message of moving our social movement out to more and more workers, but to date we haven't come up with a perfect model to make it a raving success. And we are interested in your experiences. We do need champions. We do need to close that gap between a great idea and an organisation that delivers. The final piece of work that we're working on is our values. How do we ensure that the community at large understands who we are and what we stand for? We've got 2 options about what we offer. The first is the flyby's version of unionism. Join us because you're in a workplace and we will add value to the rate you get paid. We'll give you services if you have a problem at work, and we'll provide you with a voice when you want to raise an issue with your employer. The second option is that we offer a movement of people with shared values, and people can participate with us, and we are capable of effecting change in relation to those values and countering proposals which cut across them. And obviously we also continue to offer some practical services. In the first version, the flyby's version, we're replaceable and are simply meeting needs. We're selling value for money rather than values. People will join us when it is economically sensible for them to do so, and they won't join us when it's not. People will respond as if they're buying a service rather than making a commitment, and they'll act accordingly within our structures. In the second version, people will be emotionally moved to be part of what we stand for. They'll want to be associated with the movement because they'll identify with our values and the activities we promote. Members or not, they will listen to us and they'll believe what we say. All modern growing social movements have strong connections to values, and many offer no services at all except those values. Organisations like Greenpeace and Amnesty, and even, I hate to say it, organisations like the Tea Party in America, They don't differentiate between members and non-members. You aren't all non-members of Greenpeace. They don't all have one standard form of association, one standard form of joining. They're not leadership driven. There'd be very few people in this room that could tell me the leader of Greenpeace or the leader of Amnesty, but they are strongly values driven, and most of you could tell me what the values of those organisations are. We are a little bit like the Masonic Lodge. If you're in, you sort of know what we stand for and you quite like it. If you're out, you have to put a hell of an effort in to find out exactly who we are and how you associate. And we're trying to change that by working together and building a social movement. We want, in 5 years' time, every family in this country to be able to say, the union movement, I like what they stand for, I can tell you what they stand for, and my moral compass points in their direction. They're the organisations that I want to listen to. That's a task we all have to undertake and develop together. We started it with the AFCO dispute, with the Wharfies dispute, with the campaigns that you people are running, protecting public services. They are all about values. They're all being run from a values base, and they, to a certain extent, have captured the public imagination again about what trade unions do in this country. We need to build on it. We need to build on that. Look, there are many other things I'd love to talk to you about, but those are the basic areas that we're working on. I do want to finish by again acknowledging the fantastic work that your union is doing, both in supporting the Union Change Program very practically. We couldn't have done it if the PSA hadn't ordered into their organisation and assisted us to run it for all of this time. We promised them it would be 6 months. I think it's been just over a year. You know, never believe what we promise you. But also just the leadership and the general support from a very, very strong union, which we need in order for us to really make change. So thank you very much, Gloria.